Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Bunga Cast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, and I'm joined by contributing editor Lee Jones in London. Hello, Lee.
Hi, yeah, it's me again.
It's you again, and it's you again on your specialist subject. If this were Mastermind, you'd be, maybe not specifically your specialist subject, but general area specialist subject. If there can be a general specialty, we're going to be talking about the Philippines. So we have spoken about the Philippines on this podcast a couple of times before. Indeed, one of our early episodes, early in the context of, well, we're reaching 500. We're nearing 500 now. Episode 52, we discussed the Philippines. It was an episode with Nicole Carato on Duterte's despotism. And we actually returned to the theme some years ago when we talked about the radical right in the global periphery, a book on that, and we touched on the Philippines along with other countries. These were, in the history of this podcast anyway, and it's 8 years or so, 9 years, one of the touch points was the emerging radical right, populist, national populism, however you wish to characterize it. And some of the places that we were, scanning the globe for, we touched on Brazil, of course, back in 2018 in the lead up to Bolsonaro's election, and indeed talked much more about Brazil, obviously, as I live here, but also talked about Erdogan in Turkey, and Duterte in the Philippines was another one of these kind of big touch points. It's like this new phenomenon that was going on. And just to make reference to something else that we discussed very recently in an episode which has just come out from the Reading Club, where we talked about internationalism, about Perry Anderson's understanding of nationalism and internationalism, and the way that internationalism has charted nationalism or followed along its course. We tried in that episode to identify what nationalism looks like today. And one of the elements of it is, or at least follow Perry Anderson's schema, and you can check out that episode if you wish to kind of have this in depth, but one of the elements of that schema was a geography of nationalism. And so Perry Anderson talks about, for example, the Atlantic revolutions as one phase of the early birth of nations and nationalism. Think about 1848, more in Central Europe, and so on. And it follows through these various phases. And what would you say then about this period now of the 2010s and 2020s? And my argument was that it was kind of in the global periphery or semi-periphery, where there is this new form of nationalism emerging. I don't know if Lee agrees with that, but certainly a figure like Rodrigo Duterte would be one such case of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was also that other episode that you guys did on an edited volume that was looking at these developments across the global south. I think, we've talked about the commonalities and differences between populism in the global north and in the south, and I think they are different. I think they do have different class bases, but there are commonalities too around kind of disaffection with the disintegrating neoliberal order, or the disintegrative effects of neoliberalism on society. So in the global south, for example, the support basis for a kind of authoritarian or national populism is often the middle class, who are looking for kind of order against kind of unruly, restive working class or precariat. And that is a little bit different, I think, to the global north, but there are some important similarities.
No, absolutely. But I think we should have a reminder anyway of whom Duterte was. He's still alive, but he's now been arrested. It's in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So, Lee, what is he notable for? He killed potentially up to 30,000 people.
Yeah, so Duterte was president of the Philippines between 2016 and 2022. And before that, he was a regional power broker as mayor of Davao in the southern Philippines. And he was quite famous at the time because he was this extremely foul-mouthed national populist who famously called President Obama and even the Pope sons of whores. He often joked about murder and rape. He took the Philippines away from its long-standing ally, the United States, and pitched towards China, trying to get support for his domestic infrastructure agenda. He was notorious for the militarization of Philippines' domestic governance, scaling up the approach that he'd used in Davao, where he operated death squads between 1998 and 2016 as mayor. And it's the ICC that began his investigation into those death squads when he scaled that up into a national war on drugs. And there are varying estimates, some in the range of 6,000 to 9,000. The International Criminal Court suggested that between 12,000 and 30,000 people had been extrajudicially killed by 2019. But actually, Duterte had threatened to kill many more. So he said at one point, Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Obviously, it was 6, not 3. But in any case, now there's 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them. At least Germany had Hitler, the Philippines wouldn't. So that gives you a sense of the kind of person that he was. He was engaged in an authoritarian crackdown on independent media, the red tagging of opponents, the jailing of his political enemies, and so on. The Philippines has got a term limit. You can only serve one term. So he had to step down in 2022. But his faction allied with the Marcos family, which goes back to Ferdinand Marcos, who was president between 1965 and 1986, and he imposed martial law and became dictator from 1972. An enormous kleptocrat. His wife Imelda is very famous for having thousands of pairs of shoes. They embezzled billions of dollars. That regime fell in 1986, and then they were sort of airlifted to the United States. But the family returned after Ferdinand Marcos died, and Imelda was plotting for a long time to put her son Bongbong on the throne, so to speak, unsuccessfully at first. But they came together in 2022, the so-called Uni Team. So Duterte's daughter, Sara Duterte, became his vice presidential candidate, and Bongbong became president. But that alliance has broken down. Duterte Jr. has been impeached, is facing impeachment trial, and Marcos has had Rodrigo hauled off to The Hague, as you say.
Yeah, so as we'll find out, there's both a kind of long tail continuation legacy Cold War anti-communism that goes on in terms of the murderous politics, as well as this bizarre dynastic politics going on in the Philippines. We're going to find all this out by speaking to someone I think we're both very delighted to be welcoming onto the podcast, a very reputed public intellectual, activist, and former politician, Walden Bello. He's the author of 10 books. He also co-founded Focus on the Global South, a research and policy institute, which is very active in the anti-globalization movement. And he was a member of the banned Communist Party of the Philippines, which he was active in during the Marcos dictatorship, and later has joined the Akbayan Citizens Action Party, and he served in Congress from 2007 to 2015. Now, his memoir, Global Battlefields, is just out with Clarity Press. We're going to talk about contemporary Philippine politics, the history, the geopolitics, and indeed some of Walden's political biography as well. Delighted to be joined here by Walden Bello. And I think Lee and I would firstly want to take the opportunity to ask you, as your memoirs are coming out. Memoirs, I should note, are subtitled "Memoir of a Legendary Public Intellectual from the Global South," which is really enticing. And even just looking over the back of the book blurb on the website, there's so much enticing stuff, and I would like to give you the opportunity to maybe trail the book, and really, actually, for those listeners who aren't familiar with your work, with your political history, to give us a sense of it. So if you would tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. I would like, first of all, to say that the title of the book, as originally envisioned by me, and which is in fact the title of the Philippine edition, is Global Battlefields: My Close Encounters with Dictatorship, Capital, Empire, and Love. And
Excellent.
that's the Philippine edition title. But as you know, publishers, uh, have their own priorities, and so for the subtitle, they substituted the memoirs of a legendary public intellectual from the global
That's
south.
another close encounter with capital.
Yeah, right. Which embarrasses me a bit because people might think that came from me. But in any event, at the moment, I have I am the co-chair of the board of Focus on the Global South, which is a research and advocacy institute that is based in Bangkok, Thailand. We're celebrating our 30th year this year, and I have also retired from teaching at the University of the Philippines, as well as the State University of New York at Binghamton. And I guess the you might want to just mention, as put in the description of me in the cover, that I in 2003 I was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. And just last 2023, I was named the most distinguished human rights defender by Amnesty International Philippines. So those are just some of the highlights that you might want me to state. And I've written a couple of books on both the Philippines and on the issues of the global south.
So Walden is being very modest.
Yes.
Walden is extremely well known in Asia and beyond as a scholar and activist. He was a member of the banned Communist Party in the Philippines that resisted the Marcos dictatorship. He was a leading light in the Akbayan Citizens Action Party, which is one of Southeast Asia's, I think, only social democratic party. And he served in Congress from 2007 to 2015. So he is a major public figure in the Philippines, and that's why we're so delighted to have him on.
Thank you.
Yeah, and indeed, I think we'll come towards the end of this back to perhaps your memoirs and your political biography to discuss perhaps some lessons for the end of history. That'll be towards the end. For now, I want to turn to the more immediate political situation in the Philippines. So I want to start with what's happening right now and peel back to understand the deeper roots of the Philippines politics thereafter. So what's behind the ICC's arrest of Duterte? If you could explain a little bit in answering that, a bit about the warring political dynasties at work behind the scenes.
Well, okay, so Duterte was president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022. And his main, mark was really the so-called war on drugs that resulted in an estimated 27,000 people who were subjected to extrajudicial execution. So these are fairly well documented from different sources, and there were appeals filed to the ICC. While the war on drugs was going on, and the ICC, in fact, took those appeals and said that since the Philippines was a member of the ICC until around 2019, when Duterte withdrew the Philippines from the International Criminal Court, that before that, the performance, or the criminal violations of human rights that the regime had committed and that Duterte committed were subject, to the jurisdiction of the ICC. So, the argument of the people who represent Duterte at this point is that since the Philippines withdrew from the ICC in 2019, therefore the ICC has no jurisdiction. But the ICC's opinion and the opinion of legal scholars and others here in the Philippines is that the Philippines that the ICC has jurisdiction until the time that it withdrew from the ICC. So what Duterte is being prosecuted for are the crimes committed before the withdrawal of the Philippines from the ICC. So basically, this arrest of Duterte took place within a competition between, the Marcos faction of the elite and the Duterte faction of the elite. They used to be allied, and they ran together as allies in the 2022 presidential and vice presidential elections. But after about a year and a few months, as we had predicted, these two the dynastic clans came into open conflict over basically the apportioning of power, because whenever you have points of unity that are just based on the sharing of power, you inevitably come into a conflict of this sort. So the you know so it was in the interests of the Marcos government to you know to comply with an arrest warrant served by the ICC via the Interpol to arrest Duterte. That was an outstanding warrant of arrest. But of course, this played into the dynastic warfare between the two, so that
Mm.
Duterte made the mistake of going out of the country. And when he returned, airports are always, areas of great problems for returning dynasts in this or strong men or whatever, because there's that period where you don't have armed bodyguards, uh, and
Mm.
and before you reach the customs area, there's that period of about 15 minutes when things can happen. And things happened to Duterte, just like back in 1986. The returning Ninoy Aquino was gunned down at the tarmac of the National Airport in Manila. Now, that didn't happen to Duterte, of course, but he was immediately snatched by Philippine authorities and transferred to a military air base and then flown to The Hague. So, what has happened, of course, is that people who have been, seeking justice for the thousands of people who have been killed, like myself, are basically saying that it was the right thing to do. That he was arrested because he needs to face justice for everything that's been done. And of course, the Duterte supporters are saying this was an illegal arrest, and that he ought to be brought back to Manila. In any event, the this whole conflict between the two, even though Duterte is now imprisoned and detained in The Hague in very comfortable quarters, by the way, which and he's being given all the opportunities to form his defense and everything. There's due process going on, and there's due process for Duterte that he always denied his victims. So that's the situation. The situation was volatile about in the weeks after the arrest took place. That has died down a bit because the country is now headed for the midterm elections, and the results of the midterm elections, particularly in the Senate, um, will in fact indicate where the wind is blowing when it comes to popular feelings. So the focus is now on the elections, and the Duterte people and the Marcos people are both pushing very hard to have their candidates win. And this is especially important in the Senate because Duterte has already been impeached in the House of Representatives, uh, but he's going to stand trial in the Senate, and people are still counting the votes there. Is he likely to be convicted? The daughter, Sarah Duterte. I'm sorry about that. Sarah Duterte, the vice
Mm.
president, has been impeached in the House of Representatives and is now going to face trial after the elections in the Senate. And so this is the big question: will there be enough senators that the the administration can muster to have Duterte or Sarah Duterte, the daughter of Duterte, impeached so that she is basically banned from holding political office? So that's, in a nutshell,
Mm.
what is happening at this point. It's
Well, I think there's a,
dynastic.
yeah. Well, I think maybe as you were about to get onto, yeah, these dynastic politics are quite complex, and we will want to get into that.
Sure.
So you set out very clearly there that this is not necessarily a triumph for the rule of law, but part of a dynastic battle between elite families. And it reminds me of a very famous book by Alfred McCoy, which called The Philippines an Anarchy of Families. And it refers to the constant struggles between dynastic clans over local national power, often very violent, infrequently corrupt. So can you just take us back and say, well, why is the Philippines like this? Why is it an anarchy of families? Do we have to go all the way back to Spanish colonialism to explain this? How would you account?
Well, I think that this rule of dynasties. Uh, I My sense is it's very much tied in to the American colonial experience that we had, because the kind of uh, representative democracy that the United States introduced, from a kind of more metropolitan setting to a rural setting like the Philippines when it took over the Philippines in the 1900s. It provided an opportunity for the different local and regional elites to compete relatively peacefully for political power, at the same time that it allowed them to come together as a class to put the people down. So basically, when we're talking about competitive democracy in the Philippines, we really, this is really a competition among elites from the very beginning of the American colonial period. So it so the kind of Lockean representative democracy that the U.S. came with to the Philippines in the early 1900s fit perfectly into the interests of the elite. Of course, there was always an effort to try to monopolize political office, but different alliances among the elites would sort of neutralize the efforts by any one faction to dominate and monopolize political
And,
power.
and
Now that
crucially,
changed.
these were landed elites, right?
Yes, landed elites. Now, of course, that changed during the Marcos period. In After being reelected to the presidency in 1969, Marcos made a move for monopolizing political power in 1972, and then we had this long period of um, martial law in the country, or of dictatorship, and there was an alienated, the alienated parts of the elite. uh, Basically, many of them were stripped of their political and economic power. Many of them migrated to the United States, waiting for the chance, of course, to come back. And when the when the regime began to suffer a major crisis of legitimacy in the early 1980s, especially after the assassination of Aquino that I referred to earlier, then this became the opportunity for this uh, alienated parts of the elite to come together, basing themselves on the middle class and getting the support of the United States, coming together in what is called now the EDSA insurrection that toppled Marcos. And basically, what this was all about was the monopoly of political power by one faction of the elite was ended, and you had a return to competitive factional democratic politics. So that's sort of the a short answer to this very important question that you've raised. Why dynastic politics is so prominent in the Philippines? I think you cannot divorce it from the way that U.S. colonialism and its institutions really intersected with the interests of the different factions of the Philippine elite.
And that was based on the mostly agrarian economy at the time, and so
Yes.
there's a comparison to be made there with the latifundista system in Latin America, I guess. But even today, the dynasties tend to be regionally based, even though the Philippines economy, okay, it's still agricultural to some extent, but obviously it has diversified. There is some industrialization and urbanization. So how has industrialization, the Philippines sort of embracing aspects of globalization, how has that changed the picture from these landed elites that sort of populated the American designed system to begin with?
Well, yeah, I mean the economy definitely has become much more diversified in the last few decades, and you've had the emergence of um, Taipan type um, 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 elites, Filipino Chinese, especially, that have um, exercised tremendous control on different parts of the economy, including real estate. Um, but um, but land um, continues to be a main source of political power, despite the industrialization and deindustrialization too that has taken place, because of globalization. Um, and the government itself, government office has really become, a source of political power. But I would say that land, especially in the form of real estate, uh, control of government offices, um, has this have intertwined to some degree to maintain the power of regional, local, dynasties. But this is why the the competition for local offices in the Philippines so fierce, because basically, so much of the budget has been decentralized, so that the implementing agencies of much of the country are at the local level. So the big fights are really over the control of this local budgets. So government is a source of political accumulation of capital accumulation. So land and government, that's really a source of tremendous political power.
Hmm.
Yeah, and the intensity of those struggles at the local level is remarkable because a lot of these dynastic families essentially maintain private armies used to
Yes.
keep the locals in line, but sometimes deployed in quite brutal political struggles with their rivals, right? So what you can see at the national level in the current war between the Marcoses and the Dutertes is
Mhm.
often mirrored at the local level, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's the competition at the at the national level, intersecting with the at the regional level, at the local level, and it's way down the line. I you know when I served, in the House of Representatives. And I served there from 2009 to 2010, 2015. It's really amazing how there's always just two political families, okay, uh, at the local level, that are competing, and the whole alliance politics revolves around these two competing political families. It's almost in every province and every town in the Philippines. It boils down to two competing elites. So that's how fierce it really is. And it's a big price because
Mm.
it's control over resources. Being able to deploy resources to employ people, fill your police force or whatever. So it's you know there's government is really a source of uh, capital.
Mm.
I
And
hadn't
political.
realized how far down to the local level these two pillars of establishment Philippine politics actually ran. And the Philippines is an awfully large place for it to be dominated just by two families. It's not like, I don't know, think of Nicaragua or somewhere where
Sure.
it's a similar situation, but it's a much smaller place. And I wonder how the question of historical memory plays into this. Now, so a lot of the Western reporting about the Marcos clan's return in 2022 has concerned the fact that the EDSA revolution, or the People Power Revolution of '86, has in some ways been not overturned. That this represents a kind of a step back. That, this is the Marcos's return, and that the People Power Revolution still has a perhaps some sort of hold on people's imagination, but at the same time, obviously, the return of the Marcos clan suggests the opposite. So I wonder if you could speak to how much, particularly amongst younger generations, that 1986 kind of late Cold War democratizing moment, how much that still plays in people's memory, and whether that, or if it's more the disappointment of the period that followed that carries more weight.
Well, let's uh, put this in perspective, because there's a myth about EDSA, okay, that we really need to deconstruct it, because for a long time there was this sense that you had this dictatorship, and that the people went into the streets, led by the Catholic Church, okay, and that combination of people going out in the streets, the religious fervor, and then a military mutiny created the conditions for a successful insurrection that became known as the People Power Uprising. That's the myth, and in a number of articles and in my memoirs, I've really deconstructed this to show that, in fact, you cannot understand the EDSA uprising without the United States and the very active role that it played in pushing Marcos to hold elections. In 1983, especially after the Aquino assassination, the United States came in a very big way and was twisting Marcos to hold elections. And I documented this with State Department documents and everything else. And the what the U.S. wanted to do was to create a sort of a partnership, although they felt it would be a contentious partnership between the elite opposition and Marcos, and so that was the big push. Now, what happened was that they did not calculate with respect to the spontaneous move of the masses in EDSA to go and support this military mutiny. So things in many ways ran out of control. Uh, and the whole idea of getting Marcos to work in a partnership, uh, with the elite opposition fell apart. Now the U.S. though adjusted fairly quickly. to that one. And the pragmatists in the State Department basically pushed Reagan, who wanted to remain with Marcos all the way, uh, that it would just create a tremendous problem for the United States, especially in the effort to prevent the left from becoming a big force if he stuck with Marcos. And that's when the United States, when Reagan basically gave the word, then the U.S. abandoned Marcos and flew him to Hawaii. So I guess what I'm trying to say here first is that uh, the U.S. was very central to what emerged in EDSA, the recreation of the elite democracy that had
Mm.
Marcos had abandoned back in the 1970s. But nevertheless, I think because of different circumstances, the different uh, forces that were active in EDSA, you did have a constitution in 1987 that had a number of quite progressive aspects, like nationalist provisions in the constitution, land reform, and a party list system to be established. Anti-dynasty system was supposed to be there, but these were sort of concessions that the elite made to the popular fervor under EDSA. So if you look at the 1987 Constitution, it's really, on the one hand, it's very much patterned after the United States, and there's some social democratic components to it. But those social democratic components pretty much uh, became neglected as time went on, as the competing elites began to again consolidate their power. Now it's the the thing is that there was this promise of EDSA of real change, of real land reform, of real redistribution that many people look to and therefore judge EDSA or the performance of the EDSA regimes or the post EDSA regimes in terms of if they would deliver um, on these promises. And they did not. Uh, and it was just elite competition all the way, blocking any sort of real social democratic changes that would take place. Or if there were some social democratic changes like land reform, they were eviscerated immediately. Or the party
Mm.
list system that we had that was supposed to be for marginalized people, the elites pretty much um, uh, took it over. Yeah. So all the sort of positive mechanisms that were supposed to be implemented for reform were basically obliterated, and and what remained was really the pure elite competition among factional groups and dynasties. So I think when you ask the question, therefore, that yes, there was a great deal of dissatisfaction with the performance of the post EDSA system. People just remember the promises and and saw what was happening, and neoliberalism, being pushed by the United States and the World Bank and the IMF, coupled with dynastic monopolies, just created a horrible situation whereby not only was wealth tremendously unequal, but we had agriculture destroyed, manufacturing destroyed, leading. Our only real growth industry was labor export. Uh, so this
Mm.
combination of neoliberalism and dynastic, competition was very deadly, and it created this sense of people that you know what had occurred under these 30 years of EDSA democratic regimes was something to be judged a failure, and that created then the conditions back in 2016 for tremendous discontent and quite a large number of people pushing for Duterte's election, and then and this being repeated in 2022 with the Marcoses coming back to power. So I would just want to say that that's a very important dimension. The unfulfilled promise of EDSA uh, explains Duterte and explains uh, the Marcoses, because sometimes there's just this easy thing that says, oh, it's because the Marcoses were able to manipulate the internet, create this
Right,
image
right.
of a golden age and that sort of thing. Yes, to some extent, but it's really the dissatisfaction with the performance of the post-EDSA system.
No, thanks. That's
So
very
that
useful. Yeah.
that dissatisfaction then is with the elite's failure to deliver on the promise of democratization. But that dissatisfaction gets channeled through a system where it's dominated by elite
Yeah,
parties, elite
yeah,
vehicles. So
yes,
this is the nature of Philippines populism, is that there's great discontent, but it only finds an outlet through elite representatives who are claiming to be anti-systemic elites. So obviously
yes,
they're not.
yes. Yeah, yes, but there's another factor here, Lee, that we need to bring into consideration, and it's the failure of the left.
Mm.
I mean, if you looked at the 1970s, that 15-year period between 1970 and 1986, the driving force of Philippine politics was the left. And in fact, this is what made the United States come in and try to manipulate the situation, because they were really scared uh, that the New People's Army, the Communist Party, was gaining ground. You had all these reports about one-fourth of Philippine villages were now infiltrated. And it was a very dynamic left movement, very innovative. And then it made a mistake. The big mistake was in 1986, when people were mobilizing around the elections. The left leadership basically said, oh, this is just going to be another contest between reactionaries. The US would never give up on Marcos. And um, and the, basically what happened is that the left became a bystander in the EDSA uprising. But the United States was able to adjust. The United States did not expect the uprising to happen, but it immediately adjusted and got Marcos out. Okay, so what this and this is when historical circumstances really play such a devastating role. The left never recovered from that. It became even more and more and more marginal because of that mistake that everybody now agrees it was a big mistake. But unless we take the inability of the left to be able to work in the new circumstances and place itself as an alternative to elite politics, we cannot really understand why elite politics has taken over completely again.
Mm.
Okay? So
Yeah,
that's the one factor that I would add.
I think it's crucial, and I think we see this across many developing countries. In fact, where populism, for example, Islamist populism in the Middle East, it takes hold to express popular grievances against contemporary neoliberalism, etc., in the context where the left has been eviscerated quite often
Yes.
eliminated. And the Philippines is interesting because, unlike in the rest of Southeast Asia, the left was not physically eliminated because the Marcos regime was pretty bad at repressing the insurgent Communist
Mhm.
Party of the Philippines. As you say, this was one of the reasons why the Reagan administration was willing to turn
Mhm.
things around. So this is not an example of physical evisceration of the left, as we saw, for example, in Indonesia, and we had a
Indonesia.
great episode with Vedi Hadiz when he's talking about the long-term legacy of that evisceration. The left is a strategic mistake. They can't transition from armed insurgency in the countryside to a parliamentary approach,
Yeah.
essentially contesting politics.
Yes, definitely. I think that was the big strategic mistake. Because even as it became clear that elite democracy or liberal democracy was here to stay, for some time, the left basically thought it was just the same enemy, but now with sort of a democratic mask, and therefore continued to put the emphasis on the armed insurgency, which no longer really appealed to the people, you know, and the more complex parliamentary politics was really something that was a challenge, but it could, it was a challenge that some forces within the left did try to make. The other thing that I think we also need to bring in here when discussing the left is, that we did have, but on a much smaller scale, the kind of physical elimination of sectors of the left. Now, the problem here was that it was people on the left themselves that did that. There was this purge called the Ahos campaign that resulted in about 2,000 cadres being executed uh, because they were thought to be enemy agents. Now, I raised that because that even Jose Maria Sison said that played
Just
such a
explain to
major
our listeners
role.
who this song was.
No, Jose Maria Sison was basically the leading light of the Communist Party in the Philippines, and he in fact said, in this document called Reaffirm, that the loss of so many cadres uh, imposed by execution within the left uh, did what so many military campaigns could never do, which was to drastically weaken the left. So that has to be taken into consideration too. The failure to adjust
Yeah.
a parliamentary system, uh, or once they've adjusted to carry things out in a fairly sectarian way, and then the purge that eliminated large sections of, significant sections of the left. So I mean, just to put the record straight, these were some of the factors that played into that post EDSA situation. I
And
document that all in the book.
what's behind those errors, in your view? Is it doctrinaire Maoism?
I would say so. I did the first empirical investigation of this, and one was definitely panic. There was just this sense that government agents had infiltrated the movement, and there was no checking the panic that was going on, and so you had panic in the ranks. The second thing was there was uh, no system of justice, that was institutionalized, that would allow these things to be carried out in a fairly just way, um, and in a fairly empirical way. And the third thing was, well, this is fairly controversial. uh, the sense of rights only belonging to a class and not to individuals, which I think is the standard Marxist-Leninist view, um, and and uh, and I would say that those factors came into play uh, during that time. It's a sad period in the left's history,
Mm,
but those were a number of the factors that we really
mm,
need to. So it wasn't just the failure to adjust to a parliamentary system, um, or once adjusting, nevertheless, to do it in a fairly sectarian way, uh, and then this whole internal purge that took place.
mm,
I guess, and then to put it back in the context of the discussion, unless we take this into consideration, we would not be able to understand why the return of elite dynastic politics was so complete.
mm,
Because if we did have the left that was agile, that was, that adapted, like Washington adopted, then we would have created more of a space to allow the kind of progressive alternatives and initiatives to emerge. So
Yeah,
that's one thing that I would just want to introduce here.
sure. I want to move to the kind of contemporary kind of left scene, if you like, but I just wanted to contextualize my last question for people who are not familiar. Southeast Asian communist parties were heavily under the influence of Maoist ideology during the Cold War, which obviously was based on, rural resistance and surrounding the cities and so on. And so when you get a shift to a parliamentary regime that might be heavily based around electoral competition, this is something that a lot of communist parties could not grapple with that analysis of the world and that way of doing revolutionary politics. Let's bring it up to date. So the left is still extremely weak in the Philippines, as it is across Southeast Asia. That's not for want of trying. I mentioned that your involvement with Akbayan, which was, I suppose, somewhat similar to the PT in Brazil, in the sense that it was a coalition of social movements and civil society organizations coming together to try to form a popular front. And as I mentioned at the start, this is quite unique in Southeast Asia for being a social democratic party. And it agitates explicitly for the poor in a society which, as you say, is dominated by a very predatory oligarchic elite and is extremely unequal. And yet it obtains very little electoral support. So can you just tell us, why is it a left-wing party does exist, but people don't vote for it? What are the challenges of doing left-wing politics in the kind of context that you're operating in?
Yes. Well, let me first say of that, you know, um, we do have a socialist senator, and the only socialist senator, and she belongs to Akbayan. Okay, and she has been practically the only source of opposition to the sort of elite dynastic politics that have been taking place. I'm referring to Riz Hontiveros. Um, and we do have within the House of Representatives, um, about 6 or 7 members of the House out of about 310 that are elected through the party list system, and this party list uh, groups that they represent are associated with the traditional left. So it's not completely obliterated in terms of its presence in the national scene. That's the first thing. The second thing is that uh, its agenda is echoed widely. Uh, like, for instance, the demands for agrarian reform, the demands for a minimum wage, the demands, for um, reproductive rights, and I was involved in many of these campaigns, including the compensation for Marcos victims. So the resonance of the leftist agenda is there, and in fact, many young people embrace it and are quite disappointed that it's not accompanied by some kind of an organizational mechanism that would that they would be able to join. So I think the big problem that we really face here is, again, the way that whenever elections come around, elections are so dominated by money politics. And in a place where you've had tremendous levels of poverty, we're talking about 25% of the population living under the poverty line, and inequality. Our Gini coefficient is in the 50s. Um, the deployment of money when it comes to the elections every 3 years really makes a very, very, very big difference. Uh, and um, and at the same time, I think that the left has been splintered. Okay? I mean, you do have the traditional left, call it the Maoist left, but the the left has not really been able to come together in because of sectarianism on the one hand, and some other factors. When in fact this is the logical way to go to be able to present an alternative. So, uh, and finally, I would say that organizing for elections in a parliamentary system has to be really taken very, very seriously, because if you're up against money politics, you should be able to really organize in a way in which you use your moral resources, or whatever resources you have, to be able to counter that. And I don't think the left really has taken the requirements of electoral competition that seriously. So I think it's this variety of factors that would account for the fact that that we do have elections every 3 years, but the left becomes more and more and more marginal with the results of each election. So that's sort of maybe a simplified explanation for why it's been so hard to counter dynastic politics.
And what role does repression play in this story? Because that's something you've not mentioned. We saw quite remarkable levels of repression under the Duterte administration, and the phenomenon of red tagging, which I think listeners outside of the Philippines will not be aware of, where basically anybody who's vaguely liberal or on the left is liable to be declared a communist and then gets mobbed online and potentially attacked in person. Is repression and the crackdown on independent media also a factor here?
Oh yes, I mean definitely. I mean, the Philippine police and armed forces have engaged in red tagging, and in again given the a free hand by Duterte, and some of the previous presidents. That kind of repression has is important in terms of understanding why the left is quite weak. But I would say though that more important than repression, although it's an important factor, has been the ability, or the lack of the ability, to be able to use the political and ideological resources to be able to present an alternative. So yes, there's repression is a factor, but even more important is the question of um, political imagination and organizational capabilities to participate in this system. So I would and you mentioned the internet. Yes, definitely. Like in so many other countries, it has the right has become much more adept at manipulating online resources than the left. And I think the Philippines is really no exception to the general rule, where the right has been so uh, versatile at mobilizing its resources, and the left has really underestimated the use of online resources to be able to promote its vision and its agenda.
I want to shift gears a bit and talk a bit about geopolitics, if you don't mind. So,
Sure.
for again, for listeners who are not aware of the situation, just to kind of spell out the geostrategic or geopolitical context, the Philippines is on the sort of southeastern or eastern rim of the South China Sea, which lies between China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And it's in a very tricky situation, if you like. It, China lays a dubious, legally discredited claim to the South China Sea area, a claim that overlaps with the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And as China has tried, I think, to push its defensive perimeter against the United States outwards away from the Chinese coast, that has brought it into conflict with the Philippines. And the Philippines also lies across the Straits of Luzon opposite Taiwan. And so the waters around the Philippines are highly strategic in terms of control, the potential access to Taiwan by US naval assets during a potential conflict over Taiwan. So the Philippines occupies a quite unique, quite dangerous and precarious position in the emerging new Cold War between the United States and the Philippines. So I just want to spend some time thinking about this and views in the Philippines on this. What is your view first on China and what the rise of China means for developing countries like the Philippines?
Well, I think I've written much about this, as Lee knows. My view is, that overall, I think China has been a positive force in terms of being able to provide the resources as well as create the policy space for developing countries, for the global south, to be able to more and more detach themselves, from the demands, and of the global north, particularly of the United States. So China has been, in my view, both in Latin America and Africa, and in Asia, China has overall been quite a positive force in terms of being able to create that space. Um, and in many ways, it plays it has played the role that the Soviet Union used to play in the 1970s, of being able to uh, allow countries to play off superpowers against each other. So that's one thing. Um, the second thing, of course, is that, and I've also been clear that there have been problems, in terms of um, China's approaches, both when it comes to the South China Sea in particular, that clearly, there is no legal basis for China to be making the moves of claiming that that whole or 90% of the South China Sea belongs to it, uh, and that its moves around, especially around interfering with resupply of um, by our Coast Guard units to the maritime formations where we have uh, units deployed. That those are actions to be deplored. And well, we have criticisms. Some valid, some not so valid about Chinese behavior, and yes, there are problems with the way that Beijing treats, for instance, the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. But overall, I would say though that that taking all of this into consideration, that China is basically a positive force for the global South. Now, coming to the South China Sea, um, I think the situation we're in is this: that, as Lee said, China is out to project its defenses outward, and definitely we can understand that, given the threat that's posed by the United States. I mean, we really are talking about a massive uh, flotilla of the United States. They have deployed about 5 aircraft carriers to the Western Pacific, and provocative moves at that. And Biden especially just sent several times uh, ships through the Taiwan Straits. So on the one hand, the moves can be seen as mainly defensive moves, But on the other hand, that does not justify the way that China has moved in terms of appropriating or claiming areas that belong to other countries, like the Philippines, by virtue of the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Seas, Convention on the Law of the Seas. Um, but what we've been pushing for, or I have been particularly pushing for, is that we really need diplomatic solutions. We cannot uh, get into the situation whereby we side with the United States militarily against China, because that is, in fact, what has happened now, especially with the Marcos administration, as well as the Aquino administration back in 2012, 2013. Um, and the problem is that whenever um, we we adopt a military stance that's anti-China, we weaken both our diplomatic position and our moral position, and make it more difficult to adopt uh, uh, um, um, uh, a non an independent foreign policy, which many of us really have been pushing for. So I did articulate a four-step process. I published this in the New York Times several years ago in 2016, whereby a process that begins with demilitarization of the South China Sea, uh, which in the Philippines we call the West Philippine Sea, which would mean withdrawal of Chinese forces from maritime formations there. Uh, at the same time that the Philippines withdraws from the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with the United States. So, a kind of a four-step process bringing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in, that begins with demilitarization and then ends uh, with a resolution of their territorial question, and sort of a series of confidence building measures. And I continue to hold that that's the only possible way to go at this point, because the U.S. really has had really no interest. Um, it's not interested in supporting resupply um, missions of our Coast Guard, uh, and protecting them. It's mainly interested in using the Philippines, as a springboard for the containment of China. And this was particularly true during the Biden administration. Now, when it comes to the Trump administration, it's it things are very fluid again. Uh, and on the one hand, you do have people who talk hawkishly, like Hegseth and Marco Rubio, the defense secretary and the State Department secretary. But on the other hand, you also have it seems that the main moves of Trump has been to withdraw to Fortress America, kind of reconcentrate forces, and in a sort of more regional sphere of influence kind of thing. And Japan is very worried at this point. Okay, uh, South Korea is worried at this point, because of the fluidity or the uncertainty of the American commitment to East Asia as they perceive it. So that seems to be, I think, Trump's ultimate position when it comes to the Western Pacific, is it remains to be really seen at this point. And but uh, you know but it would be important to see what opportunities there are that are being offered by this uncertainty of Trump's position, uh, in the Western Pacific, because if it offers the possibility whereby the Philippines can, in fact, have a more sane, a more healthy policy, a foreign policy that would be more independent of either superpower, then I think that would be quite positive.
It's notable that the Marcos administration seems to be doubling down on the alliance with the United States. And they've been treaty allies since the 1950s, but as you pointed out, different presidents have taken different views. Duterte was more pro-China before peeling back to the United States, but Marcos seems to have doubled down, which in some ways is kind of remarkable because, as you say, uh, Trump's China policy is still not clear. I mean, my view is, we're kind of debating this on this podcast. What does Trump mean? What is US
I can
foreign policy mean, etc. We're all trying to work it out in real time. My own view is that the United States actually remains committed to a policy of containing and confronting China. But we could debate that until the cows come home. But there's still a massive question mark over that, as you say. And then if you look at the way that Trump has treated European allies, much closer to the United States than the Philippines has ever been. If you look at the treatment meted out to Ukraine, it seems mad to me that countries in Asia, governments in Asia, would not be rethinking
Mhm.
their relationship with the United States in a fundamental way. But there just doesn't seem to be any sign of that in the Philippines at the moment. Is that right?
Yes, uh, I think outwardly there isn't, but I think there is also apprehension within that's not being articulated in government uh, um, announcements. That we have a very volatile situation with Trump, and that if you look at, you're right. People are looking at Ukraine. Okay, people looking at the way that he's been treating Western Europe. And saying that if these are the long-standing allies of the United States, both politically and culturally, you know, should we shouldn't we be expecting something similar
Hmm.
to happen here? And so I think that definitely when it comes to Japan and Korea, you have those are those apprehensions clearly articulated. There are those in the Philippines, but I think you're right. The outward show is doubling down, but nevertheless, I think that um, there is apprehension, and there is apprehension that China is seen by the Marcos government as basically working to promote the interests of Duterte. So there's that intersection of foreign policy and domestic policy that I think creates tremendous apprehension within the Marcoses, among the Marcoses.
Just outside of the elite, what's the domestic politics of the geopolitical question? So, is there popular debate about whether the Philippines should be aligned to China or aligned to the United States or somewhere in between? Is it just kind of mouthpieces of different dynastic groupings, or is there genuinely a kind of lively political debate? Where do different groups fall on this question?
Well, I think that the the Dutertes are seen, and in fact they act like they are really very much in China's pocket. You know, uh, the Marcoses, of course, as you say, have doubled down. Other section, the we've had these surveys taken about how people feel about China and the United States, and the only places where I believe the only places where the United States rates, you know, is higher in popularity terms than China is Vietnam and the Philippines. Okay, so but I think at the level of the domestic popular opinion, it's very pro-American still, and then you do have certain factions of the elite, but mainly the intellectual elite, and not so much the dynastic elites like Judge Carpio and others, that have taken a very strong critical view of China, and the left, and I would put myself there, have also taken a strong and critical view of the United States. So so I would say that, I would say that there is debate, but in terms of the traditional elites, they're more or less in the U.S. camp, uh, and in terms of mass public opinion, it's more in the U.S. camp. So that's the way that I would put it at this point.
I'll
Yeah,
move
I
to
mean, I
the
did see.
final.
I don't know how much store to put in these polls, but I did see reported this week that a Singaporean poll of Southeast Asian nations had found that for the first time, opinion between in terms of favoring China versus favoring the U.S. had swung to 50% or above 50% in favor of China across the region. But of course, great variations within these countries.
Sure.
In Vietnam and in the Philippines were the ones which were around 80% in favor of the US. And
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how much store to put in polls like that, especially over these big geopolitical questions. But that does seem,
Well,
nevertheless, quite resounding.
the one that you're referring to, uh, it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine. So it's a poll of regional
I thought it
elites,
might be.
um, and it's not very scientific. It's a kind of
Yeah.
interesting snapshot, but you can't track these things over time
Sure.
because it's a self-selecting survey, and the respondents change year on year. But the gap has narrowed. But
Mhm.
as you say, there are kind of broad patterns. The Vietnamese are generally pro-American, but these polls obviously started before the tariffs, and Vietnam is one of the countries most exposed to Trump's tariffs. So who knows, that might change. But the Philippines is interesting because, I often say it's the most American country in Asia, because of the colonization, because of the predominance of English among the elites. It's culturally remarkably American, and loads of the elites, they send their kids to be educated in the United States, and in
Mhm.
particular, the diplomatic corps is extremely wedded to the United States and the military. And the military has become quite dependent on the United States to supply it, to
Sure.
train it, to direct it.
Mhm.
And I think this is partly what kept the Philippine state, as in the state apparatus, wedded to the US alliance, even under
Sure.
Duterte, who was leaning towards the
Sure.
Chinese.
Definitely.
Mm.
Definitely. I fully support it. Basically, what I've been telling the people over here is, you know, our defense and foreign policy have been outsourced to Washington. So, what do we need the Department of National Defense for, or the Department of Foreign Affairs? So it's uh, but it's not new. I
No.
guess it's just been accentuated at this, especially during the last 3 years.
Okay.
And
I'm
yeah,
going to.
and they definitely, as you said, they definitely, the military, for instance, basically uh, was the force that told Duterte, you're not going to um, eliminate the visiting forces agreement. I mean that, so Duterte did not, was in fact, despite his rhetoric, did not follow through in that because of the threat of the military that they would not go along.
So
Okay.
on this podcast, the tagline of this podcast is the Global Politics Podcast at the end of history, and the thesis of the podcast, I guess, is that the end of history period was real, it existed, but it's over. And since 2016, the it's not like history is back, but it's the end of history order of neoliberalism, of globalism is just breaking down, and we're witnessing its advanced decay today. And that's what the podcast has been all about. You've come to, after many decades in politics, you've come to write your memoirs, Global Battlefields. You've been involved in a lot of political battles in your life. So, what is your advice to our listeners as we confront this very confusing new terrain?
Well, again, here, Gramsci is very useful. I mean, he's become more and more of my North Star. Uh, uh, and the two things that I always fall back on. Uh, One is that classic saying of um, um, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Uh, and there's a lot of reason for the pessimism of the intellect, especially when it comes to the rise of counter-revolutionary fascist movements. Um, and more and more, you basically just have to have this leap of faith, the optimism of the will. Okay, so um, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that very interesting saying that he has, that um, that the what he said is uh, the old order is dying and the new still has to be born. And in the meantime, the monsters are coming out. Uh, so my sense is that he's definitely right. He was right about his time, but I think he has something to say about our times that you really cannot um, have opportunities emerge without crisis coming together with them. That there is not something determined in history. That basically it's us people, movements acting subjectively on the forces around us that will help make the difference. And that's why, again, I don't know whether that rates as advice. Certainly, it rates as very important insights of what happens during tremendous periods of tremendous flux. And so so basically, rather than leave with with more articulated, more concrete advice, I would just like to end with those two sayings from Gramsci.
All right, very good. I guess we will leave that there. Walden, thank you very much for joining us.
Sure. Thank you. I'm very happy to.